They thought they could break him with fines, threats, and intimidation. The HOA claimed he was violating rules no one had ever heard of, sending letters, pounding on his door, and even showing up late at night just to prove their power. But what started as petty harassment quickly spiraled into something far more sinister. Neighbors whispered, tempers flared, and before long, the entire community was caught in the crossfire of a battle that should have never begun. Was this about property lines and paint colors? Or was something darker hiding beneath the surface? For years, Marcus believed he had finally found peace. After working double shifts and saving every dime, he moved his family into a quiet cul-de-sac where kids played freely, lawns were manicured, and every neighbor waved as they drove by. It was the kind of neighborhood he thought would finally give his children stability and safety. The first few months felt like a dream. Weekend barbecues, evening walks, and the simple joy of watching his kids ride their bikes on a smooth, well-kept street. The community looked perfect on the outside. Every home painted the same shade, every garden neatly trimmed, and not a single mailbox out of place. At least that's what the HOA wanted everyone to believe. It didn't take long before Marcus noticed small cracks in that perfect image. A neighbor whispered warnings about certain board members who watched every move. Cars parked just a few inches past the curb would mysteriously get violation slips. Families who spoke up in meetings suddenly found themselves drowning in fines for petty things like trash cans left out for an hour too long. Marcus brushed it off at first, telling himself it wouldn't happen to him. He paid his dues, kept his yard spotless, and followed the rules as best as he could. But what he didn't know was that the HOA had already set their sights on him. And once they decided to make an example out of a homeowner, there was no turning back. Rising action. At first, Marcus thought the letter was a mistake, a bright orange slip taped to his front door, claiming his grass was overgrown by half an inch. He laughed it off, grabbed his lawnmower, and cut the yard again the same afternoon. But when the second letter arrived only days later, this time demanding a $75 fine for improper edging, his laughter turned into unease. The rules kept coming like clockwork. One week, it was his garbage can left out too long. The next, it was a basketball hoop his kids had set up in the driveway, something he'd seen nearly every other family on the block do without consequence. What stood out wasn't the supposed violations, but the way they always seemed to target him. Marcus began noticing things he couldn't ignore. A gray sedan parked near his house at odd hours, a clipboard barely visible through the windshield. Neighbors he used to wave at now crossed the street instead of meeting his eyes. Conversations seemed to hush when he walked by. The perfect neighborhood suddenly felt suffocating, like a stage where everyone was playing a role, except Marcus was cast as the villain without knowing why. The fines snowballed. $75 became $150, then $300. Each time he tried to appeal, the HOA board rejected him with vague references to community standards. He asked for the bylaws in writing, but they stalled, saying the documents were under review. Marcus knew the rules weren't being applied fairly. He had photos of neighbors with worse violations than his own who never received so much as a warning. But the board didn't care about fairness. They cared about control. The harassment grew bolder. Late one night, Marcus's security cameras caught two men with flashlights walking around his property line, measuring tape in hand. They weren't landscapers, and they weren't city officials. When Marcus confronted the board the next day, they denied knowing anything about it. But a week later, he received a letter accusing him of building a fence 2 inches higher than allowed, with another hefty fine attached. By now, Marcus's wife was anxious every time the mail arrived. His children asked why people whispered at school about their dad being a troublemaker. It wasn't just about money anymore. The HOA wanted to isolate him, to shame him into submission. Marcus tried reasoning with them. He attended the next board meeting in a cramped room in the community clubhouse where a dozen homeowners sat in folding chairs. When it was his turn to speak, he calmly laid out his case: the selective enforcement, the stalking, and the unfair fines. He thought his neighbors would rally behind him, but instead, the board cut him off, accused him of disrupting order, and threatened to suspend his voting rights in the association. The message was clear. This wasn't a democracy. It was a regime. And Marcus, he was their target. The pressure didn't stop at letters and meetings. One evening, as Marcus pulled into his driveway, he found a large neon sticker plastered on his garage door: "Delinquent, pay your dues." His kids saw it before he could tear it down. The humiliation burned deeper than any fine. When he demanded answers, the HOA claimed it was a clerical error, but Marcus knew it wasn't. Someone had gone out of their way to brand him as an outcast. The breaking point came when Marcus woke up to find his car towed from his own driveway. The HOA claimed it was abandoned because it hadn't been moved in 48 hours. Never mind that it was registered, insured, and fully operational. He had to pay nearly $400 just to get it back. By now, Marcus wasn't just angry. He was determined. He began documenting everything: letters, photos, videos, and timestamps. Every violation notice went into a thick binder. Every suspicious incident was backed up on hard drives. He knew he couldn't fight them with emotion alone. He would need proof. But the HOA was watching him too. At a neighborhood gathering, one board member leaned in close and whispered, "You're not going to win this. We always win." Marcus didn't reply, but inside he made a vow. If they wanted a war, he would give them one. The tension reached a fever pitch when Marcus received an official-looking envelope stamped with bold lettering: "Final notice, lien proceedings initiated." The board claimed that because of unpaid fines, they had the authority to seize his home. The very house he had worked his whole life for was now hanging in the balance. All because he refused to bow down to their petty control. But what the board didn't know was that Marcus wasn't as helpless as they believed. He had allies, knowledge, and resources they could never have anticipated. And as the walls of intimidation closed in, he was preparing to strike back in a way that would shake the entire neighborhood to its core. Because Marcus wasn't just a homeowner. He was about to become their worst nightmare. Clem. The day of reckoning came in a packed courtroom. The HOA board, smug and confident, sat together in a row like royalty awaiting tribute. They had brought binders of their own, full of photos and papers, convinced they could prove Marcus was the problem. But when Marcus's attorney began laying out the evidence, the mood shifted fast. Photos showed identical violations ignored for other neighbors. Security footage revealed strangers creeping around Marcus's property at night. Copies of letters exposed contradictions and fabricated claims. The binder Marcus had so carefully built over months became the board's undoing. The judge's questions grew sharper. Why were fines tripled without notice? Where are the signed approvals for these inspections? Why does your bylaw list say one thing and your violation notices another? The board stammered, sweating under the weight of their own arrogance. The final blow came when Marcus's attorney produced the lien notice. It wasn't just heavy-handed, it was illegal. The board had no authority under state law to threaten seizure without court approval. What they had sent Marcus wasn't a legal document at all. It was intimidation dressed up as one. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The board president tried to speak, but the judge silenced him with a gavel strike. When the ruling came, it was decisive. Every fine was thrown out, the lien was nullified, and the HOA was ordered to pay Marcus's legal fees for harassment and abuse of power. The board members sat frozen, their empire of petty control crumbling in real time. For Marcus, the moment wasn't about revenge, it was about relief. The months of fear, humiliation, and sleepless nights finally had meaning. As he walked out of the courtroom, neighbors who had once avoided him now nodded in respect. Some even clapped. Marcus didn't smile. He simply carried his binder close to his chest, knowing the fight was over. But the story was just beginning. Resolutions and impact. When the storm finally broke, it wasn't with shouting or fists pounding on doors. It was quieter than that, almost anticlimactic at first. A letter, just one sheet of paper, delivered by certified mail stamped with the seal of the county court. Marcus stood in his kitchen holding it, his binder of evidence spread across the table like a war map. His wife hovered beside him, bracing for more bad news. But as his eyes scanned the page, something shifted in his expression. For the first time in months, the knot in his chest loosened. The court had ruled in his favor. Every fine, every accusation, every so-called violation had been declared invalid. The board had overstepped its authority, failed to follow its own bylaws, and engaged in harassment that violated state law. The lien threat was null and void. The judge's words were clear. The HOA's actions were not just improper, they were unlawful. The impact was immediate. Within days, the board's president resigned. The treasurer followed. 2 other members stopped showing up at meetings altogether. The perfect little neighborhood that had once seemed untouchable was suddenly fractured, its leaders exposed as bullies who had abused their power. But the victory was bigger than paperwork. Marcus wasn't just free from the fines, he was free from the fear that had followed him home every night. His children no longer asked why neighbors whispered about their family. His wife no longer winced every time she saw a letter in the mailbox. The weight that had pressed down on their household lifted, leaving in its place something else: resolve. Word spread quickly. Other homeowners who had quietly endured their own violations came forward. One family admitted they had been fined for painting their shutters the wrong shade of brown, even though it matched the HOA's official palette. Another shared how their car was towed from the driveway just like Marcus's. Each story echoed the same theme: intimidation masked as community standards. Marcus's fight had given them courage. At the next meeting, the room looked very different. Gone were the smug smiles of board members drunk on authority. In their place sat nervous replacements, hastily voted in after the resignations. And in the rows of folding chairs, dozens of homeowners, some angry, some relieved, all watching closely. Marcus stood in that room, binder in hand, but this time, he didn't need to raise his voice. The judge's ruling had already spoken louder than anything he could have said. He simply reminded everyone of one truth: power only lasts as long as people are too afraid to challenge it. The months that followed reshaped the community. Rules that had once been weaponized were rewritten with clarity. New bylaws required transparency. Every fine had to be documented with evidence, every lien approved by a majority vote, and every board decision subject to homeowner review. What had been a shadowy system of intimidation was dragged into the light. Neighbors who had once avoided Marcus now stopped by his driveway to thank him. Some apologized for not speaking up sooner. Others admitted they had been afraid of retaliation themselves. Slowly, the street began to feel like a neighborhood again, not a battlefield. But Marcus knew better than to believe everything was perfect. The scars of the fight lingered. His children still remembered the neon sticker on their garage. His wife still remembered the sleepless nights, wondering if they would lose their home. And Marcus himself, even in victory, carried the weight of how close the HOA had come to destroying everything he'd worked for. And yet, he also carried something else, a reminder that resilience matters, that silence empowers bullies, but persistence can bring them down. The true impact of Marcus's battle wasn't just the legal win or the resignations, it was the ripple effect. Other neighborhoods heard about what had happened. Local news outlets ran stories on HOA abuse of power. State legislators began drafting amendments to limit just how far associations could go in punishing homeowners. One man's fight in a quiet cul-de-sac had sparked conversations far beyond his street. Years later, people still remembered. When new families moved into the neighborhood, they heard the story of how the HOA once tried to crush a homeowner and how he fought back until the system itself had to change. To some, Marcus was just a neighbor who kept his lawn neat and waved at passersby. To others, he was the man who stood up when no one else would. And to his children, he was proof that you don't let fear decide your future. The house that nearly slipped through his fingers became more than a home. It became a symbol of resilience, of justice, of the simple truth that ordinary people can stand against unfair systems and win. When Marcus looked out across his yard, freshly cut and perfectly edged, just the way it always had been, he didn't see fences or bylaws or board members anymore. He saw freedom, hard-earned, costly, but unshakable. And as he stood there, breathing in the quiet evening air, he asked himself a question he hoped others would too. If power can be abused in the smallest corners of our neighborhoods, how many other places are we letting it go unchecked?